Imagine saving someone's life only to be met with fear and accusations, not gratitude. What should have been a heroic moment for Marcus turned into handcuffs and public humiliation, all because of the color of his skin. In this true story, we witness how quickly a black man's life-saving act transforms into presumed criminality. Marcus pulled Emily from the path of a speeding car, yet found himself treated as a suspect rather than a hero. Stay with me as we unpack not just what happened, but what it reveals about the burden of proving innocence in a society quick to assume guilt. How many times must justice prove elusive when extraordinary courage crosses racial lines? What drives someone to risk their life for a stranger? As Marcus walked home that evening, he couldn't have known his next decision would change everything. Marcus's footsteps fell into their familiar rhythm along the concrete sidewalk. After finishing his shift at the community center where he mentored local youth, his walk home had become a cherished ritual, a rare 30 minutes to decompress before reaching his apartment. Like most evenings, he maintained an awareness of his surroundings that had become second nature. He kept his hoodie down despite the evening chill, made sure to nod politely at passers-by without lingering eye contact, and instinctively moved to the opposite side of the street when he saw a woman walking alone ahead. Small calculations that black men learn to make in public spaces, invisible accommodations to others' potential discomfort. The intersection ahead glowed red as traffic slowed. Marcus noticed her immediately, a young white woman, perhaps in her late 20s, head tilted downward at her phone, thumbs rapidly moving across the screen. The crosswalk signal clearly displayed the red hand, but she stepped forward anyway, completely absorbed in whatever message demanded her attention. Simultaneously, a blue sedan accelerated to the intersection, the driver running the red light with reckless abandon, on a collision course with a distracted pedestrian. In that moment, time seemed to fracture. Marcus processed multiple realities at once. If he did nothing, he would witness a preventable tragedy. If he intervened, he risked becoming the villain in a story not of his making. Years of conditioning had taught him the potential danger of approaching white women he didn't know, especially with physical contact. The mental calculation occurred in milliseconds, weighing a stranger's life against his own safety. His body made the decision before his mind fully processed the consequences. Marcus lunged forward, covering the distance between them in 3 powerful strides. His hand gripped her shoulder firmly as he pulled her backward with enough force to move her body, but not enough to cause injury. The momentum carried them both away from the curb as the sedan blasted through the space, where Emily had stood just seconds before. The rush had displaced air washing over them, the driver oblivious to the near tragedy they'd caused. "Are you okay?" Marcus asked, his heart hammering against his ribs, adrenaline surging through his system. His hand had already released her shoulder, creating appropriate distance as he scanned her for any signs of injury. The woman, Emily, stared at him, her expression unreadable as the phone remained clutched in her trembling hand. Marcus expected shock, perhaps gratitude, or at minimum, acknowledgement of what had just occurred. What happened next defied that expectation entirely. Emily's expression transformed, her initial wide-eyed shock hardening into something else entirely. Her features contorted as her brain processed his presence through the distorting lens of threat perception. Research shows that racial bias fundamentally alters how we perceive intentions, transforming acts of assistance into perceived aggression when filtered through pre-existing prejudice. "Get away from me," Emily screamed, stumbling backward, her voice piercing the evening air. "Help! He's attacking me!" The accusation cut through the intersection, drawing the attention of everyone within earshot. Marcus froze, his hands instinctively raised in a defensive posture, the universal signal of non-aggression instantly making him appear more suspicious to onlookers who hadn't witnessed the rescue. In one moment, Marcus saved a life. In the next, he became someone to fear. But why did Emily react this way? And how quickly would others join her perception? Emily's scream didn't just travel through air. It rewrote reality for everyone within earshot. The transformation was almost instantaneous. Heads turned, conversations halted, and bodies pivoted toward the commotion. A businessman stopped mid-call, eyes narrowing with suspicion. 2 college students lowered their coffee cups, whispering assessments of the situation. Within 30 seconds, the first ring of onlookers had formed, creating an invisible boundary around Marcus and Emily. "Is she okay?" a woman in a red coat called out, stepping closer to Emily while maintaining a careful distance from Marcus. Her question wasn't directed at both parties involved, only at the perceived victim. The woman's body language spoke volumes. Shoulders angled toward Emily, creating a subtle alliance through positioning alone. "He grabbed her," someone murmured from the edge of the gathering crowd. The statement wasn't posed as a question but declared as fact, despite the speaker having arrived well after the actual incident. Marcus opened his mouth to explain, but found himself speaking into a wall of hardened expressions. "I was trying to save," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through his system. "We all saw what happened," interrupted a man in a business suit, though he couldn't possibly have witnessed the entire sequence of events. His authoritative tone carried weight among the growing assembly, each word cementing the narrative against Marcus. The crowd had grown to 15 people now, arranging themselves in a semicircle that unconsciously placed Emily as protected center while Marcus stood isolated at its edge. Some pulled out phones, not to call for help, but to document what they presumed was the aftermath of an assault. Their screens formed a technological barrier between humanity and judgment. "There was a car," Marcus tried again, noticing how a couple physically stepped backward when he raised his voice slightly for clarity. The unconscious message was clear. His volume was perceived as aggression rather than emphasis. He lowered his tone immediately, recognizing the familiar behavioral calculations required of him in this moment. A young woman who had been texting looked up at her friend and whispered, "Should we call the police?" The question itself revealed presumption. Not, "Should we find out what happened?" but it jumped straight to enforcement. Her friend nodded gravely, already extracting her phone from her purse. The psychological phenomenon unfolding was textbook conformity bias. Each new arrival absorbed the collective tension and adopted the prevailing narrative without questioning its foundation. A teenager who joined the edge of the crowd asked, "What's happening?" and received 3 different responses, all variations of "that man attacked her." The accusation had become truth through simple repetition. Emily stood trembling, her earlier fear now transforming into something more complex as she watched the crowd's reaction validate her initial misinterpretation. When she spoke again, her voice carried the strange confidence of someone whose version of events has received social confirmation. "He came out of nowhere and grabbed me." Marcus recognized the shifting power dynamics with a sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't his first experience with presumed guilt. He had faced similar moments throughout his life, though rarely with stakes this immediate and public. He looked around at the faces surrounding him, searching for anyone who might be assessing the situation independently, but found only variations of the same judgment reflected back at him. "Please listen," Marcus said, keeping his hands visible at his sides, a practiced posture meant to telegraph non-threat. The light was red. There was a speeding car. I pulled her back from. "Stop making excuses," snapped a middle-aged woman who had positioned herself protectively beside Emily. "We don't need to hear your story." The dismissal was crushing in its finality. Your story, implying fabrication rather than fact. 27 people now stood in judgment, none of whom had witnessed this act of heroism, yet all seemingly convinced of its opposite. For power and presumption when authority arrives. The sound of sirens pierced the tension-filled air, growing louder until 2 police cruisers squealed to a halt at the curb. Blue and red lights painted the faces of the gathered crowd in alternating hues as 4 officers emerged, immediately scanning the scene before them. In that first critical moment of assessment, their eyes locked onto Marcus, the only black man in the crowd, standing apart from the protective circle that had formed around Emily. "That's him, officers," someone called out from the crowd, a voice Marcus couldn't identify, but one that sealed his fate in that moment. The officers moved with practiced efficiency, their approach to Marcus noticeably different from their colleagues, who veered toward Emily. 2 officers advanced on Marcus with hands hovering near their holster weapons, their stance wide and authoritative. "Sir, put your hands where I can see them." The command cut to the murmurs of the crowd, transforming the public space into an impromptu detention scene. "I didn't do anything. I was trying to help her," Marcus stated calmly, raising his hands slowly, painfully aware that any sudden movement could escalate the situation. He'd been here before. Not this exact scenario, but this feeling of presumed guilt. It sat in his stomach like a stone. The cold metal of handcuffs clicked around his wrists before he could fully explain. The officer's grip on his arm was unnecessarily firm as they turned him toward the patrol car. From the corner of his eye, Marcus could see the other officer speaking softly to Emily, offering her tissues, a gentle hand on her shoulder, comforts not extended to a man they'd already decided was the aggressor. Marcus felt his chest tighten as pedestrians stopped to witness his humiliation. Children pointed. Phones recorded. Each second in handcuffs chipped away at the persona he'd carefully constructed through years of community work and professional achievement. In an instant, he was reduced to a stereotype, the dangerous black man who needed to be controlled. "Officer, there was a car," Marcus began, his voice steady despite the churning in his stomach. "Sir, I need you to stop talking right now." The officer interrupted, the dismissal revealing how little his narrative mattered in this exchange of power. Near the patrol car, Marcus overheard snippets of Emily's account to the female officer, comforting her. "He grabbed me. I was so scared. I don't know what he wanted." Each word twisted the knife, reconstructing his act of heroism into something sinister. The officers nodded sympathetically at Emily's story, never questioning the logical gaps or asking why she'd been in the street. Their acceptance of her version was immediate and complete, a privilege granted without evidence. "She's lying," Marcus said quietly to the officer beside him, knowing the risk of the statement but unable to remain silent. "I pulled her from the path of a speeding car. She was about to be hit." The officer's expression hardened. "Everyone has a story, sir." Marcus recognized the futility of resistance. Any protest too forceful would only confirm their preconceptions. Any emotion too visible would be labeled as aggression. The tightrope he walked in this moment was familiar. The burden of proving innocence while being presumed guilty, all while maintaining a calm that shouldn't be required of someone wrongfully detained. "Wait!" A voice cut through the procedural hum. A young Asian man pushed forward to the crowd, phone extended in his hand. "I have it all on video. I recorded everything." The officers exchanged glances as the man approached, turning his phone screen toward them. "Look, he saved her life. That car would have hit her if he hadn't pulled her back." A small crowd gathered around the phone, watching as the truth played out in undeniable digital clarity. Marcus's sprint toward danger, the blue sedan blasting to the red light, Emily's certain death averted by his quick action. Murmurs rippled through the onlookers. Some who had been most vocal in condemning Marcus now found sudden interest in their shoes. Emily's face flushed as the video continued, capturing her transformation from victim to accuser with uncomfortable precision. The handcuffs loosened and fell away from Marcus's wrists, leaving behind both physical marks and invisible wounds that wouldn't fade so quickly. Conclusion: the video of Marcus's rescue spread across social media platforms within hours. Like digital wildfire, it ignited heated debates in comment sections and sparked panel discussions on news networks. Yet for Marcus, this virtual vindication offered little comfort as he walked away from the scene, the phantom sensation of handcuffs still pressing against his skin. Emily stood nearby, her face flushed with embarrassment yet defensive. "I misunderstood the situation," she muttered, the carefully chosen words falling short of an apology. The officers returned Marcus's belongings without meeting his eyes, their silence an institutional refusal to acknowledge wrongdoing. This was the cruelest paradox. In the same moment Marcus became a hero online, he remained just another black man who had to prove his innocence in person. The psychological toll of such experiences accumulates like invisible scars, forcing many to calculate every public interaction, knowing heroism and criminality can be assigned to the same action, depending on who performs it. As Marcus disappeared into the evening crowd, the question lingered in the cooling air. In a society where black existence itself is often perceived as threatening, how many videos, how many witnesses, how many sacrifices are required before innocence becomes a default assumption? Even when that innocence comes paired with extraordinary courage. If this story resonated with you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps bring more powerful stories to light. Drop a comment below with your thoughts. What would you have done in Maya's shoes? Let's keep the conversation going.